You feel the pressure of your husband's calloused fingers tighten around yours beneath the coarse wool blanket. The gesture is tender, almost desperate, but neither of you moves beyond that. 3 feet away, your mother-in-law's breathing rattles in her chest, each exhale a wet reminder that you are not alone. You never are. The fire in the hearth has burned down to embers, casting shadows that dance across the faces of your sleeping children, your husband's unmarried brother curled by the door, and in the corner, the pregnant sow that will feed your family through the spring. This is intimacy in a world without walls, without doors that lock, without the luxury of being unseen. Every heartbeat witnessed, every whispered word overheard, every moment of tenderness stolen from the margins of a life lived entirely in public. How did anyone survive this? How did love endure when privacy itself was a concept that did not yet exist? Before we step further into this forgotten world, I have to ask, where are you watching this from? It genuinely amazes me that we can explore these intimate medieval lives together, connected across centuries and continents by nothing but curiosity about how our ancestors lived and loved. The year is 1347, in a stone cottage outside York, England. The household you've just entered is not unusual. It is, in fact, utterly typical. 8 to 10 people occupy a single room barely larger than a modern bedroom. This is not poverty speaking. This is simply how life worked. Even among the minor nobility, privacy was a foreign concept. Archaeological excavations of 13th-century English manor houses reveal that most bedchambers contained multiple beds, separated by nothing more than hanging fabric or wooden screens. Among peasants, even those dividers were luxuries few could afford. The entire architecture of medieval life was designed around communal existence. The great hall of a lord's manor served as dining room, courtroom, workspace, and at night, a dormitory for dozens of household members and servants. The solar, a private chamber reserved for the lord and lady, was not truly private at all. Children, relatives, and trusted attendants often slept there too. If the wealthy could not find solitude, what hope did a Yorkshire farmer and his wife have? Yet the birth records tell us a different story. Families continued. Children were conceived. Marriages were not merely legal contracts, but living relationships that sustained emotional bonds across decades of unimaginable hardship. Somehow, within the cacophony of snoring relatives and grunting livestock, couples found ways to express desire, to conceive children, to nurture the fragile thing we call intimacy. The question is not whether they managed it. The question is how. The answer lies in a web of unspoken codes, choreographed timing, and a form of communication so subtle that it left almost no trace in the historical record. What we know comes from fragments. Church court testimonies about marital disputes, medical texts that inadvertently reveal assumptions about sexual behavior, and the rare personal letters that survived the centuries. One such letter, written in 1356 by Margaret Paston, a minor noblewoman in East Anglia, offers a glimpse behind the curtain. Writing to her sister, Margaret describes a system of coded phrases she and her husband developed. A comment about checking the grain stores signaled a desire for privacy. An observation that the fire was burning low meant the evening's plans should be postponed. These were not romantic euphemisms. They were survival strategies, a private language spoken in public spaces. But codes alone could not create the conditions for intimacy. Couples needed timing, opportunity, and an almost supernatural ability to read the rhythms of household life. The medieval day was structured around agricultural necessity and religious observance. Dawn brought the bell for lauds, signaling the start of work. Dusk brought vespers, marking the transition to evening activities. Between these bookends, the household moved as a collective organism. Privacy had to be carved from the cracks in this rigid schedule. Spring offered the best opportunities. As the days lengthened and the weather warmed, couples could escape to the fields under the guise of checking crops or gathering herbs. The forest, though dangerous, provided secluded spots for brief encounters, but these excursions carried risks. Bandits roamed the roads. Wolves still inhabited the woods, and neighbors, always neighbors, watching from their own fields, ready to gossip or report suspicious behavior to the local reeve. Summer brought a different calculus. The long days of agricultural labor meant exhaustion often trumped desire. Harvest time filled homes with hired hands, migrant workers, and relatives from neighboring villages, compressing already cramped quarters to the breaking point. Yet, paradoxically, the communal nature of harvest work also created opportunities. A couple working together in a distant field might find a few stolen minutes behind a hedgerow, their absence explained by the demands of gathering a particularly stubborn crop. Winter, however, was the cruelest season for intimacy. The cold made undressing genuinely dangerous. Frostbite and hypothermia were not abstract fears, but real threats that killed people every year. The early darkness compressed all household activities into a few precious hours around the fire, and the close quarters meant every sound, every movement, every breath was audible to the family members huddled together for warmth. This is where the bed itself became a character in the story of medieval intimacy. Not the modern bed, an island of privacy in a private room, but the medieval bed, a fortress within a shared space. Built high off the ground to avoid drafts and rodents, enclosed by heavy curtains that served as both insulation and psychological barrier, the bed was the only place in a peasant's life where the illusion of solitude could be maintained. Those curtains, often the most expensive item a family owned, created a cocoon where couples could imagine themselves alone even when surrounded by sleeping relatives. The curtains muffled sound. They blocked sight lines. They transformed a corner of a crowded room into a private world. But even within that enclosed space, intimacy required extraordinary discipline. Bodies that had gone unwashed for weeks. Clothing that served as both day wear and night wear, never fully removed. The constant presence of insects and the very real possibility that a child might wake and pull back the curtain at any moment. Medieval couples developed techniques for what we might call minimal impact intimacy, slow, deliberate movements, breath control, the ability to remain nearly silent even in moments of intense emotion. These were not skills taught formally. They were passed down through whispered instructions from mother to daughter, father to son, on the eve of marriage. And yet, there were forces even more powerful than architecture and timing that shaped medieval intimacy. The church, the institution that married couples, also policed their bedrooms with astonishing specificity. Canon law designated certain days of the week as forbidden for marital relations. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays were off-limits, leaving only 4 days when intimacy was religiously sanctioned. Advent, Lent, and the weeks surrounding major feast days required total abstinence. A woman's menstrual period was considered a time of impurity during which sexual contact was sinful. Pregnancy, once visible, meant cessation of relations, followed by a 40-day purification period after childbirth. By the Church's calculations, a married couple in full compliance with religious law could legitimately engage in marital relations perhaps 60 to 80 nights per year, less than a quarter of their married life. Did couples obey? The evidence suggests a more complicated reality. Church court records from the 14th century are filled with cases of couples accused of violating these strictures. But the very existence of these cases tells us that someone was watching, someone was reporting, and couples lived under constant surveillance not just by their families but by their entire communities. The confessor, that priest to whom every Christian was required to reveal their sins, became an unwilling expert in the intimate lives of married couples. Manuals for confessors from this period provide extraordinarily detailed questions priests were instructed to ask. Did you engage in relations on a forbidden day? Did you use any means to prevent conception? Did you engage in any position other than the one sanctioned by the Church? The answers to these questions were supposed to remain confidential, but in a small village where everyone knew everyone, Confidentiality was a polite fiction. Children, of course, presented the greatest challenge to marital privacy. In most medieval households, children slept in the same room as their parents well into adolescence. The concept of a separate children's bedroom simply did not exist outside the highest ranks of nobility. Young children were often oblivious to what occurred in their parents' bed at night. But older children? That required a more delicate solution. The answer was a form of collective, willful ignorance. Children learned, through unspoken instruction, to sleep deeply, to ignore certain sounds, to understand that some activities were strictly adult territory. It was a form of education through silence, a social contract maintained by the entire household. But there is something even more remarkable in the historical record than the logistics of privacy. It is the evidence that despite these extraordinary constraints, medieval marriages were not merely reproductive contracts, but genuine emotional partnerships. We find this in the letters that survive, in the wills that specify burial next to a beloved spouse, in the church court testimonies where widows and widowers speak of their deceased partners with tenderness that transcends legal formality. One case from 1338 involves a widow named Alice, who sued her late husband's family to retain ownership of their bed, not because it had material value, but because, in her testimony, it was the place where we knew joy together. The court granted her petition. The seasonal rhythm of medieval life created a kind of natural choreography for intimacy. Winter nights were long and cold, making the shared warmth of the marriage bed a practical necessity as much as an emotional desire. Spring brought renewal of energy after the deprivations of winter. Summer offered outdoor privacy. Autumn's harvest celebrations provided rare moments of communal joy, lubricated by ale and cider when normal social constraints relaxed slightly. Economic pressures also played a role. In times of scarcity, hunger and exhaustion were powerful dampeners of desire. But after a good harvest or a successful market day, the relief and optimism could translate into physical affection. The medieval understanding of marriage recognized this reality. Love was not separate from survival. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, impossible to extract from the shared labor of staying alive. And then there were the techniques couples developed for building intimacy throughout the day, not just in the few minutes available at night. Touch that appeared accidental but was deeply intentional. A hand steadying a wife as she climbed over a stile, a husband adjusting his wife's head covering, fingers lingering on her neck for just a moment. The sharing of a cup during meals, lips touching the same rim. These micro-communications, performed in full view of the household, created a private language of desire that was invisible to everyone except the couple themselves. The preparation of food became an act of love. A wife saving the choicest portion of meat for her husband. A husband surprising his wife with honey obtained through trade, a luxury so rare it bordered on the miraculous. These gestures, witnessed by the entire family, carried layers of meaning that transcended their surface function. The role of the midwife in medieval society extended far beyond childbirth. She was often the only person in the community with detailed knowledge of female anatomy and reproductive cycles. Women consulted her secretly about timing intimacy to maximize or minimize the chances of conception, about herbal remedies that could prevent pregnancy, though such knowledge was officially condemned by the Church, about what to do when intimacy became painful or difficult. The midwife's knowledge was passed down orally, woman to woman, existing in parallel to the official medical texts written by men who had never touched a woman's body. This underground network of feminine wisdom operated in whispers, creating a space for women to discuss matters that were supposed to remain unspoken. But here is the paradox at the heart of medieval intimacy. The very constraints that made privacy impossible also created a different kind of closeness. Modern relationships often struggle with the burden of excessive choice, the tyranny of unlimited privacy, the isolation that comes from nuclear families living behind locked doors. Medieval couples had none of those problems. Their intimacy was forged in the crucible of constant proximity, shared hardship, and mutual dependence. They could not escape each other. They could not retreat to separate spaces when conflict arose. They had to develop communication skills, conflict resolution strategies, and emotional resilience that modern couples might envy. The silence they maintained during intimate moments was not just physical discretion. It was a form of mutual protection, a shared secret kept from the world. There is one more element to this story that the historical record only hints at, but which must have been central to medieval married life: the power of anticipation. When intimacy is always available, always accessible, it loses some of its emotional charge. But when every encounter must be carefully planned, when desire must be held in check for days or weeks at a time, when the simple act of being alone with your spouse becomes a rare gift, then intimacy takes on an intensity that transcends the merely physical. The medieval couple lying in their enclosed bed, surrounded by sleeping family members, conducting their intimate life in near silence, experienced something that is difficult to recreate in our age of unlimited privacy. They experienced the erotic power of constraint. The tenderness that comes from knowing every touch is precious precisely because it is fleeting and fragile. The Black Death, which swept through Europe beginning in 1347, the same year as our Yorkshire cottage, changed everything. The massive loss of life meant surviving families suddenly had more space and resources. The psychological impact of widespread death shifted attitudes toward pleasure and intimacy. People sought comfort and connection more urgently, less willing to postpone joy for the sake of religious strictures. The decades following the plague saw a subtle but measurable shift in household architecture. More rooms, more privacy, but also more isolation. The unintended consequence of privacy was the loss of that collective resilience, that network of mutual support that had sustained medieval families through centuries of hardship. So, what did we lose when we gained our private bedrooms and locked doors? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. The medieval couples who found intimacy in impossibly constrained circumstances were not happier than we are. Their lives were harder, shorter, filled with losses that would break most modern people. But they understood something about intimacy that we have perhaps forgotten: that privacy and intimacy are not the same thing. That the deepest connections are forged not in isolation, but in the decision to create sacred space within a profane world. That love is not about having perfect conditions, but about choosing tenderness despite imperfect ones. And perhaps that is what haunts us most about that Yorkshire cottage in 1347. Not the lack of privacy, not the crowded sleeping arrangements or the constant surveillance, but the realization that two people, lying in a straw bed surrounded by relatives and livestock and the grinding reality of medieval life, might have known something about intimacy that we, with all our locked doors and soundproof walls and unlimited privacy, have somehow lost. They understood that the heart of intimacy is not space but choice, not silence but understanding, not isolation but the courage to love someone fully even when the whole world is watching. And that is a skill we may never recover.